In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the world of brushes and experiment and see all the different marks and strokes that these brushes can make and how to look after them best. There are so many brushes when you go into an art shop and it is super overwhelming. I still get overwhelmed. I get very excited, but I'm also very overwhelmed. But I have definitely found my sort of tried and true shapes, and I can run through them with you. So if you're just starting out with watercolor, there are 3 different shape types that I would recommend to you. And I would always use a soft brush rather than a hard bristle brush. So the 3 shapes that I would recommend are the classic round brush, which has this nice point. The second shape that I love so much is the filbert brush, and it's got this gorgeous oval shape. It's essentially a flat brush with a lovely oval end, and it absorbs a lot of water and makes tons of amazing shapes. So this is a real winner, this one. And a blend of the 2 is this Cosmotop spin. So you can see it's got that beautiful point of the round brush, but it's got the body, what's called the belly of the brush, is very, very similar to your filbert brush. And then your square brush, again, comes in many different shapes. And you will find that these square brushes are called flat brushes or bright brushes. And flat brushes tend to have a little bit of a longer body, so it's more of a rectangular shape. And this one, which is a little bit more square, is called a bright. I just call them all square brushes, and you will be able to decide whether you like having that extra kind of body of the brush of a flat, or whether you like this more square kind of shape of the bright. So moving on to one of my favorites is this foam brush, and you can pick these up from hardware stores. They're super cheap, and I use mine all the time. I use them almost as much as I use these larger sort of squarer brushes. The reason that I love them is, 1, because they're cheap, they're accessible, and they can make so many incredible marks, and they hold so much ink and water. So it's great if you want to do big marks or you're working on larger pieces of paper. And you don't have to worry so much because they are a little more disposable, but you still have to look after them. They're still good mates. And finally, another great one from any hardware store is just your decorator's brush. And often they come and they can be very, very flat. So I usually take a pair of scissors and I just snip into them like you're cutting someone's bangs. You just kind of snip into the edge to give a little bit more texture. You can start with any of the brushes that I've introduced to you, but I do think a round brush is probably a nice safe bet. If you had to just buy one brush, I would go with a size 14 round brush as the first place to start. So now we've had a look at our brush types, I'm going to show you some marks that we can make with it. I'm just dipping into my water first and then into the black ink. I go into the water first so that the brush is a little more saturated, doesn't just suck up all my colour because it's dry. And the first mark that we're going to make with our brush is just kind of planting it on the paper like a potato print and just push it down. And I'm just going to do a whole line of them. And you can see, as we go along, we're getting a bit more texture as the brush dries out. So just experiment with that. And this mark is awesome if you want to do petal shapes. I'm going to just show you how we can use that shape. And we're going to just move our body slightly as we go around the clock. There we go. And you can layer up those marks. Now, if you're familiar with dahlia shapes, this is a really nice one for building up all those petals. So that's a great mark for you to start with. Next up, this is a nice mark for just loosening up your body, okay? So give your shoulders a wiggle out. You can get really tight when you're painting. So deep breaths, and then just hold your brush almost between just two fingers like it's dangling. And don't even worry about the marks that you're making. Just let it touch the paper and move your body. Let it drag, make dashy marks, because it's really just about loosening up. The yoga of the brush moves. Just really some lovely Zen, grassy moves. And I use this a lot actually when I'm painting flowers, and I don't want to do long, wormy stems. Sometimes stems can be quite tricky, can't they, with flowers? So I do these little dashy marks, and then I fill in between them. Another great use for the round brush is for leaves. And this can be a little bit trickier because it's all about the pressure and kind of moving your body to change the shape. So we're going to start with the brush at about a 45-degree angle from the paper, and we're just going to touch the tip of the brush down to the paper, and then we're going to push down like that, and then just gently pull up, and just push down, gently pull up. And you see as my brush is drying out, I'm going to get a little bit more texture, and sometimes you get these kind of painterly ends that are a bit more textured. And some people don't like those because they want it to be smooth, but I kind of embrace all of the marks. So we're going to tear this one off and start with our next piece of paper and our next brush shape. So next up is one of my absolute favorite brushes, and that is the filbert brush. Again, I'm going to just wet my brush and dip into my ink. And we're going to start with that same potato print mark, right? And I'm just going to make that mark. I mean, it's just so good. Look at that. Look at those lovely textures. And just to move on from this mark, is the mark that I like to use a lot when I'm painting big, like peonies or anything that's got a lovely texture in the petal, like a poppy. So it's called this, I'm coining it, it's the smush. And this is it. And you just kind of, like, it's not really aggressively smushing, but just like you're putting quite a lot of pressure, and the brush is kind of dry. So I would use that as a start point for my flower, just like that. So the wonderful thing, once you become more aware of all the different marks that you can make with your brushes, you can create the essence of your subject with just a few marks. You don't have to get into too much detail. You don't have to fill in with a tiny brush. You're boom, boom, boom. Those are some great marks that you can make with this filbert brush. Now, this guy is pretty awesome, and it's not necessarily, the Cosmotop Spin is not one that you have to buy to begin with. This is actually, I only bought it maybe a year ago, was the first time I used this. And I was very excited, very, very excited when I did. But it's definitely not like a beginner brush, but it's fun nonetheless. So let's see what kind of marks this guy makes. So we've got, as you can see, that lovely pointed tip. Wouldn't this be gorgeous for like sunflower petals? I think that would be perfect, actually. And again, look how it's just more textured as we go. Okay, and let's get on to our next brush. So now we're on to our final brush, and that is a square brush. Wet both of my paintbrushes here. Now the reason I'm using this ink today is because it's very accessible. You can pick this up, Indian ink, from anywhere. I added a little bit of water to it because it's very dense and you don't need that much. So again, saving yourself a couple of dollars. Put a bit of water in there. So let's start with this brush. So we're just using that potato print shape again. Like less pressure, you'll get smaller shapes. It may seem obvious, but honestly, until you sort of do it yourself, you don't really sort of realize how much you can get from each brush, you know? So it's really worth experimenting. So I use this square brush to paint flowers too. That just gives them a different look. So maybe I'm using that square brush and it's a little bit more graphic of a look. Isn't it cool how it like makes these sort of sharp shapes? It'd be great for if you were doing a dandelion. Now I want to really show you one of my favorites, which is the sponge brush. So I'm going to dip my sponge brush directly into my ink. And the reason for that is I want to show you the texture that you can achieve. It's quite saturated there, but look how gorgeous it is as we get drier and drier. You can also make some beautiful flower shapes. So it's quite wet, so I've put down this basic pale shape here. And I'm just using my dirty water now because all I want is a light indication. There we go. That's a nice start for a poppy. Now I'm going to dip back in here, dab it off because I don't want it to be too wet and drippy. And now I'm just going to come in and use the very edge of my brush for those filaments of the poppy. You see how delicate you can get with this big, fat sponge brush. It just takes a bit of practice. And also, pick up some painter's brushes. Just dip the tips into my ink. This is really good for if you want to do some splats. Love a splat. Or leafy trees, or something textural. So we've used our brushes, and now we want to look after our brushes. If you want your brushes to last, which we obviously do because they can be a bit expensive sometimes, you want to wash out your brushes every time you use them and just really look after them. So give it a good rinse. And if you have a nice mild soap at home, you can use that. So you give that a good lather up with your soap and then give it another rinse. And you want to make sure that you get all that soap out because the soap can be as bad if you leave it in as if you leave the paint in there. So make sure it's all out, give it a nice good rinse with some clean water and then dry it off. Just get that excess water out, but not all of it because we're going to shape our brush just with our hand. So you want to just, whilst it's wet, push it back into the shape that it should be. So dry your brushes out on a nice, clean piece of paper towel ready for you the next time that you want to paint. We want to look after them. They're our best mates. So now we've had a look at some of my favorite brushes and we've looked at all the different ways that we can create marks through repetition and practice and enjoyed getting to know them. Endless, endless uses, and I hope that you enjoy the practice of experimentation with your new best mates.